Hello and welcome back to Sunday Seminary. This is our brief introduction to Paul and the Pauline letters, the Pauline epistles that we will be talking about over the next few weeks. We're going to start next week talking about Galatians and First Thessalonians. I also put Second Thessalonians on there, but don't worry about that in terms of reading ahead. Focus on First Thessalonians and Galatians, and in that order actually. First Thessalonians we think is the earliest of the Pauline epistles. We're not really sure about Galatians, but I'll treat each of those in turn. So then the week after that, we'll move on to Colossians. There's a lot of reading for the Colossians. If you want to just focus on parts of 1st and 2nd Colossians, that is fine. Too, you can kind of hunt and peck around with 2nd Colossians especially. It might be a grab bag letter. That is, it might be a bunch of different letters edited together, which we'll talk about in 2 weeks. But today, the point is to introduce who is Paul and just give some kind of basic introduction to Pauline studies. That is, what are biblical scholars saying about Paul? In any event, here we go. Introduction to Paul. We come across Paul in Christian circles as a conflation, like really kind of a melding of the Paul that we find, the character Paul that we find in the book of Acts, and the character Paul that we find. I mean, maybe not character is not a great way to put it, but the Paul that we find in the letters. And those are two actually different sources of information for Paul. If you think about it this way, if you ask your best friend to explain who you are, or if you ask your parent to explain who you are, or maybe if you ask 10 different people to explain who you are at 10 different points of your life, and you kind of get a little picture of who you are through those explanations, and then you look at your own writings about yourself, if you're supposed to write an autobiography, you may find some pretty distinctly different ways of describing who you are. And that is true of Paul in his own letters and the Paul that we find in Acts. That is to say, there's a difference. Paul didn't write Acts, and the person who wrote the book of Acts, which is the second part of the Gospel of Luke, the person who wrote the book of Acts definitely knew about Paul and knew about Paul's journeys and so on, and had some pretty interesting insights into Paul's person and probably some information that was historical about Paul, and also the letters of Paul. But the Paul we come across there matches up in many ways with Paul's own descriptions of himself in his letters, but also there are some really interesting discrepancies that we'll get to in a few minutes, and we'll see these kind of throughout as our few weeks on Paul as we talk about him. But in the book of Acts, Paul is depicted as this positions the church away from Peter, who dominates the first part of the book of Acts. We see that there's this transition point between Peter and Paul, and then the second half of the book of Acts really focuses on Paul as the message of the gospel moves from Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, that is the areas kind of around Jerusalem, the homeland of the Jews, as the message moves out and radiates out into the Gentile world. This follows the geographical procession that the Gospel of Luke, but also the beginning of the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 1, where the assumption of Jesus is, there's this miraculous event narrated at the very end of Luke, but also at the beginning of the book of Acts. You see the disciples are told to bring the gospel to Galilee, but also Jerusalem, Samaria, Galilee, and then onto the ends of the earth. So the story kind of progresses in that way, starting really near Jerusalem and then moving out as the church grows. So Paul plays the role of that person who transitions the church into really mainly a Gentile institution. So he is this kind of huge and important figure in that story, but also really interesting is that, you see this in Paul's own letter too, in Galatians. We'll get to that more next week in the details of it. But Paul starts out as a minority figure in the book of Acts. He is a strange person, actually a person who persecutes Christians, as he says in his own letters too, and then becomes this incredibly important figure. But also he's a martyr. At least it's hinted in the book of Acts that he's a martyr, right? He's on his way to Rome. They don't actually show him dying in the book of Acts. It ends before that happens. Even though Paul kind of sets his face toward Rome in the same way that Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem in the book of Acts. So it's setting you up for that as a conclusion, but strangely enough, it doesn't. The book doesn't actually go on to say that. Paul's actual historical death is a mystery. There is no source that tells us about this until well after the events of Paul's death. The church tradition holds that he was a martyr in Rome. And if you actually end up going to Rome or any other place, I have a picture here. This is images from Pisa, and Paul is depicted as holding a sword, the implement according to tradition of his own death. And he's holding a book there. That's a Bible. He is an outsized figure in Christian history, in part because he wrote a lot of the New Testament, or became the New Testament. But it is important to recognize that he might not have been as important a figure at the time that he was living as it seems that he is now. That is, the book of Acts is written some 20 years later or so after Paul's death. Maybe even longer. By that time, Paul seems to have been a really important figure, at least in certain parts of Christianity. And of course, his letters end up dominating the New Testament. But just to say, he keeps, not only in his own letters, but in the book of Acts, he does seem to be downgraded and dismissed by other leaders of the church who were alive at the same time as him. Another just important thing to know about Paul is that he and Peter are often called the pillars of the church. Here they are actually at Hosios Lukas monastery in Greece, and here they are depicted actually as literal pillars, and you'll often see this, Peter and Paul. Peter here is depicted on the left-hand side of your screen with a white beard and a full head of white hair, curly often, and then Paul on the right, often depicted as partially bald. I don't know why. I guess, oh yeah, that's right, his physical description in the Acts of Paul and Thecla, a non-canonical sort of Acts, another version of the book of Acts that focuses on Paul and Thecla, which I may have a chance to talk about actually later on when we talk about the pastoral epistles later on. So in any event, but you see Paul often mostly bearded but mostly bald, and he's oftentimes carrying a sword, or depicted here as carrying a big book as the author of much of the New Testament. So in any event, pillar of the church, that was how he was remembered for a long time. And there's other depictions of Paul that you see throughout the history of the church, like for example, Augustine depicts Paul as the author of like this interior crisis of spiritual faith, who then resolves it with this idea of grace, and you see that same thing in St. Martin Luther and in other Christian theologians who follow the Reformed tradition. There's many other ways to depict Paul and to think about Paul. What we're going to try to do is to, in the next few weeks, is to bracket some of these ideas about Paul that we already have so that we can see his letters with fresh eyes, and maybe not read things into his letters that may be only found in other documents. So let's try to have a fresh point of view when it comes to Paul. So, about his letters. There's 13 letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament. 7 of those are completely undisputed. That is to say, well, maybe not completely. I'm sure there's scholars out there who argue with this, but it's very hard to find scholars who have a beef with Romans, or that Paul didn't write it or something. But Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon are undisputed Pauline letters. There are disputes about when he wrote some of these things, or the occasions, like why did he write these things. But there are also 3 disputed, what we call Deutero-Pauline, or like Second Paul, right? A pseudepigraphal, or letter written in the name of Paul, letters, Ephesians, Colossians, and 2nd Thessalonians. Though that's kind of in a descending order of disputation there. Ephesians is the most, or I guess the least disputed Deutero-Pauline letter. That is, most scholars who look at Ephesians say, yeah, Paul didn't write that. There's a lot of interesting things about Ephesians, and we'll get to it. It's one of my favorite letters. That is to say, the fact that Paul didn't write it doesn't mean that I think anything less of it. In fact, I think great things about Ephesians, and I love Colossians as well. Colossians, there's a few major scholars who think that Paul might have written it, but most people who think it's a Deutero-Pauline letter think that it was written not long after Paul's death. That is to say, Ephesians knows Colossians and builds on it. And then 2nd Thessalonians, it's so short, it's hard to really know, and some people have some strong opinions about this. I don't, personally. Now, to say that there are Deutero-Pauline letters, or letters written in the name of Paul, may sound like I'm dismissing them, diminishing them, saying we should cut them out of our Bibles, or perhaps it sounds quackish. I think it's really important to realize that the way that letters were written in the ancient world is different than how they were written today, but also just writing in general was very different. In the same way that many people employ computer coders to code things, but they themselves don't code them. That is the CEO of Microsoft. Bill Gates doesn't code things anymore, or I guess he's not CEO anymore, but when he was CEO of Microsoft, much of the time he was not coding. He had people to do that for him, even though he had ideas about what to do. That is how much writing happened in the ancient world. So a person who was a famous scholar like Cicero, would have a scribe to do the writing for them, but they would come up with the ideas, and often big chunks of the details to the actual scribe. That is to say, they would give them the big ideas, they would give them important lines that they wanted them to really get, and then they would allow them to fill in the rest. Yada yada yada. You do that part, which is maybe how some let's say lawyers would leave things to paralegals sometimes, right? You fill in some of those details, but I'll get the big part, the important parts lined out for you. So we don't know for a fact that Paul does this, but Paul sometimes in his letters will say, look how big I write with my own hand, or here I'm writing with my own hand at the end of some of these letters, and that suggests to us that Paul wasn't really writing all of these physically by himself, which also means that scribes might have been composing some of the things that we read in there as well, but Paul was sure to kind of sign it with his own name and write the last little bit. And writing on papyrus is a hard thing to do, so they had official scribes to do that for them. Another thing to think about is that Paul sometimes signs these letters along with other people. So Paul, we look at 1 Thessalonians, which you're going to see, Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy. He's writing these things with other people and gives them credit sometimes for writing different parts of these. And then in the ancient world, there were also the sense that once you had a school of people, Paul has up to 40 people that he names in his letters that are not just like friends of his, but are working on his behalf and for him, and are taking these letters places and are writing things for him, with him. You've got a big group of people who are really trained by Paul to do this. Once Paul dies, it's a pretty common thing in the ancient world for people to write in the name of their teacher, of the person who founded their school. Just like Plato writes a lot of things about Socrates. I mean, everything that Plato writes, not everything, but most of the things that Plato writes, Socrates is a main character in them. It's really stories about Socrates. And he puts words in Socrates' mouth that he probably never said. But it's kind of an homage to his teacher, but also it carries on the lineage of his teacher. It's what the teacher wanted him to do. So all to say that this is probably like Ephesians and Colossians. Those are letters that are written carrying on Paul's legacy not long after he dies, perhaps some longer than others. But it would have been understandable in the ancient world. It wouldn't sound like someone was trying to pull the wool over your eyes or lie to you or cheat you or trick you. These were people who had deep relationships with these communities and people who knew both, both the community and the person writing it would have known Paul and would have been commissioned by him in a way. And then lastly, we have these 3 pastoral or pseudepigraphal letters. These are also written in the names of Paul, but also written to these other people who are parts of his ministry. These, because of certain ethical differences between what Paul says and then what these letters have in them, suggest that they come from a later date. We'll get to the details of that argument later, but 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus seem to be written again in the name of Paul, and written to someone who probably also had already died, that is Timothy and Titus, but who were famous at that point from being people who were, worked alongside Paul with letters, and these were ways for Christians to think about what Paul might have said about their ethics, their ethical situations of really transformative times. And we'll get to what those times were later, but this is part of the early Christian community trying to think through what would Paul say to us today. And they were writing these letters in his name in that way. So the reason that those Deutero-Pauline letters, the disputed ones, Ephesians, Colossians, 2nd Thessalonians, are disputed in part because of the theology that's in them. They seem a bit different than Paul. Colossians has this kind of mystical, supernatural, cosmic Christ that we don't really see Paul ever talk about anywhere else, and it's such a big deal in Colossians that it just seems like someone else has started to think about Jesus in a slightly different way, but informed by Paul's message. And then Ephesians kind of builds on Colossians. You can see parts of Colossians and Ephesians, but it builds in a slightly different direction. And part of it is about style. It's written in a style that sounds a little different. Part of it is theology. Part of it is the words that they use, the actual words that they use, the diction. So if there are all these words used in Ephesians that are never used in any of Paul's other letters, that leads people to be a little bit suspicious about it. Now, All to say, this is not a science; it's an art. So, First Thessalonians actually looks pretty different than Paul's other undisputed letters. So, but no one disputes it. So, all to say, Paul could have been writing in a really very different way in Second Thessalonians, or a very different way in Colossians. That was over the course of his ministry or career, and it's just different. I write letters and books, even and articles that probably sound pretty different from one another too, and I wrote them both. So we don't know for sure, but it does help us, I think, especially with the pastoral letters. I'll get to this later on in the semester, but it really more, I think, if we interpret them as coming after Paul's death and really as a reaction to Paul. But in any event, you can judge for yourself when we get to Ephesians and Colossians and Second Thessalonians especially. So, who was Paul and what happened with Paul? The first thing is that when we're approaching, I'm going to take anything out of the book of Acts that is not attested in the letters as well, and use it as a foundation for reconstructing the person of Paul, as I'm going to use that understanding to interpret the letters of Paul. And the reason is that there are some frequent disconnects between Paul's letters and the book of Acts. Some of these are minimal and don't really matter very much. Some of these are pretty, small. Wouldn't actually, one of them, I've got an example here in Acts 17. Paul goes to Athens, and in Acts, he doesn't take Timothy. It says he doesn't take. He goes alone. And in 1 Thessalonians 3, he takes Timothy. Doesn't matter. Doesn't really matter that much. I mean, that's not a big deal. But sometimes there are some big differences between Acts, the Paul that we see in Acts, and the Paul that we see in his own letters, how he describes himself. I mean, one of those really important things is to say, is Paul a really faithful Jew? In the book of Acts, it says, yes, Paul is an incredibly faithful Jew. That is, he is always faithful to the law. And in fact, it says this several times. It's one of his defenses against the Romans, is that I've always followed the law. I've never stopped following the Jewish law. Paul, in 1 Corinthians, that he actually gives up following the Mosaic law, the Jewish law, sometimes, if it benefits. Things he says is, I could be all things to all people, right? So there are lots of versions of Paul out there. He recognizes that and he admits it. Just like there may be many different versions of you out there. But in any event, but Paul in 1 Corinthians, he says in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 21, mentions that he'll act like a Gentile when he's around Gentiles. In Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 to 14, he mentions also that he sometimes doesn't follow the law. He often does. He doesn't dislike the law. He loves the law. Is that there are times to abrogate it, or there are times to suspend it if it's beneficial for him with a Gentile community. So, all to say, does Paul follow Jewish practices? Well, that's a big difference between Acts and his letters. Or what about, how does the Jewish God, Yahweh, how does the God of the Jewish people relate to the pagan gods? In Acts 17, Paul says very famously that the Mars Hill, right, the Areopagus, or the Mars Hill dispute, where Paul sees this statue made to an unknown god, and he says, well, we don't know what the name of this god is. This is the entire point, is that it's to an unknown god. Well, this is the God I'm talking about. This is the one who created the whole world, etc. In that discourse, he even says that the Roman people are ignorant. They don't know that there's only one God out there. How could they? So God hasn't judged them for it. But Paul's here to bring the message that there is only one God, etc. In Paul's own letters, especially in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 and 32, Paul says, look, the pagan Romans, they know there's only one God. They know it deep down in their bones, and they've decided to reject it, which means that God's upset with them. Well, these are two very different messages that you bring. Now, is Paul just bringing two different messages at two different times? He seems to be very strongly advocating for them in both of those instances. So either Paul changed his mind, or maybe we have a discrepancy between the book of Acts, and what Paul is saying in Acts 17 is very consistent with the theology of the book of Acts as a whole and the Gospel of Luke. If we kind of read them together, it's very Lucan. That is to say, maybe Luke is taking Paul's message and shaping it to fit a bit more consistently with what his overall message is, just like we'd hope any storyteller would do, right? I mean, you want to tell the good story, but also you want to tell it in a way that helps you to make your main points. So anyway, that might be what Paul is, the Paul of Acts is helping. And lastly, when did Paul go to Jerusalem? This might seem like a little insignificant thing, but actually it ends up being a big question for us. One question we'll actually come back to a whole lot over the course of the next few weeks, and that is, what was Paul's relationship with the Jerusalem church? So in the book of Acts, Paul has his Damascus Road experience and ends up going to Jerusalem and stays there for a long time and ends up getting to know some people. In Galatians, he ends up, Galatians chapter 1, verse 15 and on, he ends up saying that he goes first to Arabia, and what does he do there? I mean, after having the Damascus Road, we don't know. He doesn't say Damascus Road there, by the way. He just says, I had a vision of Jesus. And then he says, I went to Arabia, and then 3 years later, he ends up coming, and he ends up emphasizing that no one there knows who he is. No one in Jerusalem knows who he is when he finally shows up years later. If no one in Jerusalem knows who Paul is, and Paul mentions this a couple times, that no one in Jerusalem really knew who he was, maybe there's a difference in the story between Acts and the story, and there might be a theological difference there on top of the historical one. So we'll take some time to look at the details of this conversation between Peter and Paul. There was really a bigger dispute about the role of Jews in community. So what do we know about Paul? So Paul seems to, from the letters alone, what can we know from Paul? Paul doesn't talk about himself most of the time. The first thing, I mean, even before we get to what's on the screen with the notes, just to know, what we have in the letters are occasional letters. These are things that Paul wrote to people at very specific times. So if we could only reconstruct your life, you watching this, if we could only reconstruct your life with 7 letters, kind of randomly for really important letters you wrote, but only 7 of them. We can only reconstruct your life from the details that we got from those letters. We might be running on thin air, right? I mean, like, we might not have a whole lot to go on with who you are, except for some vague details, right? Paul, thankfully, actually, a couple of times in these occasional letters, written to communities that he had known for a long time, well, maybe not all of them. Romans, he doesn't know yet, but he knows some people there. But in any event, he writes these letters to these communities, and a couple of times he does actually kind of talk about himself a lot, and he goes into some great detail about his own life. So, I mean, and he mentions offhandedly some things that are really helpful for reconstructing who he is, according to these letters, in some other areas. But really, in Galatians chapter 1, verses 11 through chapter 2, verse 14, he talks a lot about his own life, and it makes sense there. He's trying to make a point, so that's why he brings up himself and his own life story. And then in Philippians chapter 3, verses 4 through 10, his own story. If you kind of just read, this is the great thing about technology here. You could pause this and go and read Galatians chapter 1 through chapter 2, especially chapter 1, verse 11 through 2:14, or Philippians 3, verses 4 through 10, and you'll see that Paul talks about his own life and his own story in some vague ways, but still it gives us a lot of good information to go on. But some other texts, he mentions also, like in Romans chapter 11, verse 1, he mentions a bit about his Jewish identity. 2 Corinthians 11:22 and in Romans 9:3, he mentions some of his kind of Jewish credentials in a way. This is kind of a theme for him. So in any event, we can, from using this information, we can break down really Paul's biography, at least from the letters, into 3 main phases, the way he tells his own life. So it starts with Paul as a Pharisee, and he calls himself a Benjaminite, which is kind of surprising, but it's one of the few tribes that ends up kind of retaining a sense of its own identity after the destruction of the northern kingdom. We have the Judah, and then the Levites would also have kind of kept this sense of a tribal identity, even though it works really differently for them. So in any event, Benjaminite group, which is where King Saul was from. There's in the book of Acts, his name is called Saul. Of course, in his letters, he never mentions that he had another name, Saul, right? He has this good Greek name, Paul, and maybe he just always had that. Another thing about his life is that his early life in the book of Acts, it mentions that he's from Tarsus, which would make sense because he writes in this pretty academically Greek style. He writes using Greek ways of arguing that you would find in the classroom, this disputation style of writing. It kind of it's like assumes that the people he's writing to are kind of in class with him, which is really interesting, and it seems like maybe he was a teacher. But he never says in his letters that he's from Tarsus, this Greek-speaking Jew. I mean, he's writing in Greek. Obviously, he's a Hellenistic Jew in some way, but we don't know that he's not from. We don't know where he's from. He doesn't really say that in the letters. So maybe he's from Tarsus. We don't know. But in any event, he starts out by the earliest mentions of his life are when he's a Pharisee, and he has this kind of like this kind of discourse where he opens up about his past as he's trying to validate who he is, really, to the Galatians and the Philippians. Good at following the law, from the tribe of Benjamin, circumcised on the 8th day, which is, following all the traditions and the customs and so on. From the very earliest of his life, he was following the traditions and the customs, brought up that way from his own family and so on. But then also he mentions that when he was kind of brought up as a Pharisee, in Philippians chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, he mentions this in some detail, that he learned how to keep the law. And many Christians have understood that Paul and kind of interpreted Galatians and Romans and some other places to think that Paul kind of hates the law, thinks it's awful, it's here to just challenge us, and it keeps us down and so on, and that grace sets us free from it, at least, that Paul doesn't really seem to hate the law, and he doesn't seem to say that the Jewish law is ever bad. I don't think that Paul ever thought of himself as anything other than a Jew. Himself as a Jew who was trying to preach the good news about Jesus, a Jew who was the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, and that was enacting the apocalypse, basically the end of the world was nigh, and there was going to be this enormous change in the world, and the Gentiles needed to hear this good news. That's how he understands himself. So he doesn't reject his Pharisaic past, or to say, I hate it, or these people are terrible people, and so on. It's a very different way of dealing with the Pharisees than we see in the Gospels. So in any event, Paul was a Pharisee and rejected in some ways the Christians and persecuted them. And he talks about this. Talk about it in the same way that Acts does. Acts has this whole story, right? The stoning of Stephen, and Paul's taking the coats and all and everything. He doesn't say that in his letters, but he does say that he did persecute Christians. And he says that he persecuted Christians. He kind of suggests that it's because he thought that they weren't teaching the right thing. And of course, teaching a crucified Messiah is pretty ridiculous. Paul in Galatians talks about how Deuteronomy 21 says that 21 verse 23 says you're cursed if you hang on a tree. So how could you believe that this guy hanging on a tree is the Messiah, right? Again, the crucified thing within Jewish tradition, so it makes a whole lot of sense. So in Galatians, in Philippians 3:6, and 1 Corinthians 15:9, he mentions that he persecutes Christians. Or maybe we shouldn't say Christians at this point, but yeah, they're Jews who follow Jesus, and Jews who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and he persecutes them. But then he has, it's written up there as the calling of Paul, not the conversion of Paul or the conversion of Saul. He never mentions that. He never mentions the Damascus Road in his own letters. But he does say that he ended up having a meeting with Jesus, and this is a really important thing for him, is that the risen Christ shows up, and in 1 Corinthians he mentions this thing that sounds kind of like an ancient creed. Like, it doesn't sound like he made it up, but it sounds like he's talking about, okay, so Jesus first appeared to Cephas, or Peter, and then like a lineage of who Jesus appeared to, and then lastly he appeared to me, the last one. And what Paul obviously means by this is that he didn't know Jesus when Jesus was alive, but he did know Jesus in a vision. He had a vision of Jesus, the risen Christ, which is the same kind of vision that Cephas had, or Peter had, and the other disciples had. So he talks about how this moment transformed his thinking about who Jesus was, and then he was called, right, commissioned as kind of like a prophet, in the same way that like Samuel, right, when he was a little boy in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 1 and 2 and so on, and 3, when Samuel is a young little boy, it's not that he doesn't need a conversion. He's a good Yahwist, he's a good ancient Israelite. But he doesn't join a new religion. He just understands it in a different way once he's called by God in 1 Samuel chapter 3. He's called to be commissioned for this new kind of prophetic ministry. And that's kind of what Paul talks about. He receives a revelation, a meeting, a call, and that transforms his life. And this message that he's been given to preach that changes his life is that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is God's chosen Messiah. So we'll get to more details in the next couple of weeks about what that exactly means for Paul according to his letters, from what we can best understand. Remember, there's a diverse Christology out there from the Gospels. We can see that they have different ways of thinking or enunciating, articulating who Jesus is, especially in relation to God. And there's also differences in what words are used to talk about Jesus, right? Like in John, like I am, and so on. So we had this kind of calling of Paul, and he, a Pharisaic Jewish beliefs still. He believes the law is incredibly important. He doesn't dismiss that or get rid of it, and he keeps his apocalyptic belief, apocalyptic Jew, just like we think that Jesus was probably an apocalyptic Jew. That is, that there was a conflict. The fundamental belief there is that there's a conflict between good and evil that is fundamental to the cosmos, and that now is a time, like this moment is a time, a decisive moment in this overall story of the conflict between good and evil, and that there will one day be a radical transformation of the world, the nature of the world, and good will win. So Paul's preaching in his letters seems to be fundamentally about that this is the moment of decisiveness. And just like he draws on these images, like in Isaiah chapter 2, we see a vision of the mountain of God in the end of times is going to be, there are going to be people from all nations streaming to it. And Paul seems to believe that the Jews are going to be there in Jerusalem. It's not going to be a different group of people receiving them, but the Gentiles will be able to arrive at the mountain as Gentiles. So Paul's not thinking about the world in terms of Jews and Christians. He's just not. Paul doesn't have a notion of that are ethnically different from Jews or that are somehow opposite Jews or something. What he has is an idea that the message of Jesus as the Messiah is hopefully one day for him going to renovate Judaism itself, but it's also going to be the door through which God invites the Gentiles in this world when everything will be good and right. So in any event, Paul then begins his career as an apostle. He says he's the last of kind of the least of the apostles, right? He only saw Jesus in a vision after he was resurrected. So, and he was the last one for Jesus to appear to. He seems to think a lot of that, but also uses, he's both humble and it's kind of humble bragging. He's both humble and brags about this kind of the fact that he was the last of the apostles. He also says, I work harder than all the other apostles, which, again, this kind of humble and bragging thing. But he thinks he has to work harder because he didn't know Jesus. He wasn't one of the ones that was elevated during Jesus's life. So in any event, that seems to be some of the kind of major story, and there's a lot more that we could talk about with Paul's life, but these are kind of the major outlines. So in any event, those are some just ways to kind of situate ourselves for our study of Paul and the Pauline epistles. Next time we get together, we're going to talk about 1 Thessalonians and then Galatians. I'll make two separate videos. I'll make them, hopefully like 20 minutes long a piece or something like that, and so you can digest them as the week goes on and not in one unending burst. But again, if you have comments about how this works or is not working, please just let me know, and feel free to email me or feel free to leave a comment here. I'll be checking the comments here on the YouTube page, and hopefully this works out. Hopefully this is a short-term thing, but no matter how long it goes, I'll be making these videos. See y'all soon.